For this little video, I want to do things a little different, you guys. You know, things have changed for me a lot. My first month-long road trip was in 1991. I was 31 years old. I'd been on trips before that, but that was the first month. After that, I was gone all summer, every summer, and we'll go back to San Diego in the winters. And I was either 95 or 96 when I left to stay on the road for good. Now, back then, I was a young man. I was full of piss and vinegar. I was chasing the women. I was looking for the action. When I read those old stories I wrote for the magazines back then, I don't even recognize that guy. You know, time and age changes you, I guess. But some of them were pretty exciting, actually very exciting. And so I want to tell you guys I'm going to have to tell this story because this was long before video and before cell phones. And so I'll have to do it with pictures because that's what I had for the magazines back then. And sometimes I didn't even have enough of those. So this was the story of my first trip into the mainland of Mexico and down into it. And I was mid-30s, somewhere late 30s at that time. And in really good, you know, it was my first trip, man. This story, by the way, goes to some really fantastic stuff that happened, right? But and you'll see, really, I mean it, stuff that blew me away. But this is the way it started. I went in, where'd I go in? Through Texas, and I ended up stopping in the town of Poza Rica, which isn't that far south of the border. And I met a teenage girl who was working at a hamburger place, and she asked me if I'd give her a ride home. And when I got there, I ended up staying with her family for 3 weeks. Now, this is a town where nobody spoke a word of English, and keeping in mind that I didn't speak a word of Spanish at the time. So it was 3 weeks. It was very lonely. I camped out in their yard, and it was really cool to stay with them. And there were some things that happened there that I'm not going to bother getting into, but eventually I left there heading south. Now, by now, the loneliness of it had gotten to me. We didn't have the phones to mellow that out any. I needed to go where there were some English speakers. And somebody told me that in the city of Oaxaca, there was English speakers. And I told myself, I'm going to go there. And if I don't, make any friends, because it could get too lonely, man, I'm going to head back out of Mexico. And so on the way there, I ended up meeting this rancher, and I stayed a night with him and two boys. And he woke us up at 5 o'clock in the morning or something to go milk the cows, which was a really interesting experience for me. At one point in this ride, I was out in the middle of nowhere, and I was driving behind a pickup truck on some little road, and we came to a toll booth, and there was a whole bunch of people there, a big mob, big crowd of them, and I had no idea what was going on. So I just stayed on the truck's tailgate, right? And the guy stopped because all the people stopped him. And he reached out the window and he dropped a few pesos into a can, and they split. And they let us through. And I just stayed on the truck's tailgate and, went in through with him because I didn't know what was going on. But if I would have known what was happening, because I later learned, I would have stopped and I would have given them a few pesos so I could take some pictures of this. But I just went with them, and I found out later what was going on. Anyway, so I ride over these mountains, this beautiful ride. Some of the best mountain rides, especially that I've had, have been down there. And I comes down into the city of Oaxaca. Now, it's coming into a new town when you don't know anybody can be very tricky and uncomfortable at first. Especially add on top of that, I don't know the land, we don't have GPS, and I don't speak the language. So I stayed the night. I found a spot to stay the night somewhere, but in the morning I woke up with a woman out in front of my tent screaming at me, saying stuff about the policia. Well, I understood that. I'm like, all right, she want me to split. So I get up and I go. Now, when I was a kid, we went down to Mexico, my family, and I knew there was a campground in Oaxaca, because we'd stayed there. I had distant memories of it. But how was I going to find it? So at a stoplight, I'm talking next to this guy on a motorcycle next to me, and I told him, somehow we communicated it, that I was looking for this campground. And he said, follow me, and he took me there. So this thing was $5 a night, and really beat up. It's the only one there. It's gone now. But So I put in a camp there. Now, I just started walking from there so I wouldn't get lost. It was a while before I started to ride the city and get a clue about how it's laid out. So I starts walking and going to get food and spending time in the campground. And there was once in a while there was a convoy of RVs that came through there, and sometimes I'd meet some of these people and hang out with them some. Interestingly enough, there was a woman there who was in one of the RVs, and she was alone, and I was younger and more attractive at the time, and she grabbed me and took me to her RV for the night, and I spent a night with her. That was a long time ago, man. And but anyways, one of the people who was staying there was an old woman named Eve. She was 72 years old at the time, and me and her became friends. She read a lot. She was in a van. She was staying in a van, and her story was kind of interesting. She and her husband had worked to when they were going to retire and travel, and when the time came, he up and died, and she was still pissed off at him, man. I don't know how you get mad at somebody for dying, but she was. And so, but we became friends, and we hung out a lot, just friends, and spent a lot of time together talking. And she was heading for Panama. She had some traveling alone in her van, and she had some trouble with her money card or something, and she was waiting on it. So she was kind of stuck there, which didn't matter. We were just hanging out for the winter. So she was an interesting character, but I started walking a lot, and I ended up meeting this group of young guys, and they liked to have a gringo around so that they could practice their English, right? And they gave me something to do, and I started hanging out with them a lot on a lot of nights. And what they would do is in the evenings, they'd go to all these different restaurants. I mean, we'd eat at tables that were thrown out in somebody's yard or in an alleyway, because this city has little streets. It was never made for the traffic it has, man. And, tall, like 2- and 3-story buildings lined on either side. So sometimes it'd be in an alleyway, but this got me in all kinds of places. And then they'd go out and they'd chase the women. They'd be to the bars and stuff. And one night, I remember riding in an old Mercedes-Benz, like a 190 or something. It's an old one with a big steering wheel, packed in there with all these Mexican guys. And there was a girl driving, and she was a hot-looking teenage. Well, not teenage. She was probably in her 20s. And I was young then, too. And she had these bracelets on, and I remember watching her bracelets shaking as she would turn that big steering wheel. But I couldn't really talk to hardly any of these guys. There was a few of them that had some English going, right? And we were in a party one night. I remember a guy there asking me, he said, "Gringo, how'd you get in here?" Like, I came with those guys, because this was getting me kind of behind the scenes. But anyway, so one night we were out, and I was getting around on my motorcycle. I was starting to get to know the city a little better. And we were in the Saloon Central, and the music was going, and people were dancing, and it was smoky because you could still smoke inside. And there's these white girls who learn to speak Spanish who come down to get there to get with the Mexican guys. I saw it with my own eyes, man. I was there, and I was like, wow, ain't that interesting? So I'm leaning up against a post, and I sees this gringo, and I bumped into her on purpose, and she grabbed me and dragged me onto the dance floor. And I said something to her, and she opened up her mouth, and it was all Spanish, not a word of English, man. And she just looked white, right? She could be taken for a gringa, but she didn't even know how to say hello, man. So, but she kept coming back and getting me through the night. And when it came time to leave, she had her son Bernardo come over, and he is, I think, in his late 20s, and he spoke pretty good English. They learn it in school, some of them, and anyways, he invited me to come back to their house. And so I was like, smelled like an adventure to me, and back then I chased anything that smelled like an adventure. Them old stories, a lot of them, man, are just off the cuff. But anyways, so we go out, and I'm following. They got a brand new SUV, and I'm following this on my old bike, and I'm going down these little streets with the buildings on the side, and we get just to the end of town there, and there's a mountain there, Monte Alban, which actually has an ancient Mayan ruin on top, but you really couldn't see that. I went up to it eventually, but you really couldn't see that from where I was. And they had a house 3-story house built on the side of Monte Alban, and the bottom was the garage, and it had electric gates. And they pulled in there, and I pulled my bike in there, and Bernardo's bike was actually in there. He had a BMW, one of those single-cylinder 650s they had back then. He was riding a BMW. And we go upstairs into the house, and this is a nice house. It was actually, she actually had it built on the side of that mountain for the view. And so Bernardo, he's staying upstairs. He's got a room upstairs where the bedrooms are. And so he goes up there and leaves me alone with his mom. Now she's looking at me and I'm looking at her, and we don't speak each other's language. And we don't really know each other. And I'm communicating to her. I'm telling her, look, it's no big deal. I can just go home. I can get on my bike and just go home. And she looks at me. And what she did was pulled down, unbuttoned her shirt, pulled out her tits, and handed them to me. So what started off as a sexual thing, really, I ended up hanging out and staying there for the night. I don't remember how long, but it started out as a sexual thing, obviously. And you know, as I became to know her, her name was Marta, but I couldn't pronounce it right. And she said when I would say it, it sounded like it was morto, which means death. So I told her, I says, I'm just going to call you Martha. And she called me Scotty. After a while, we learned to communicate with each other a little bit. But anyways, getting ahead of myself. So anyways, I spent some time with her, and she's obviously very wealthy. This was a typical poor American white boy meets rich Mexican girl story, which was pretty outlandish. But anyways, so I start seeing her some, but I go back to my campground, and one day she shows up at the campground with her SUV, and she packs all my stuff into the SUV and moves me into her house. So now I'm staying with a wealthy Mexican family. Her bedroom is upstairs. So I'm sitting upstairs working on my computer. At that time, I was still working on that book of mine. I had servants bringing me coffee and breakfast in the morning, and Martha knew what I liked to eat, and so she would get it if I wanted mangoes or whatever. That stuff was always in the house. Up on the porch from the top floor, you could see the city, and there would be guys driving goats or sheep by, you know, and there'd be guys coming by in carts pulled by ox carts that were made out of, you know, like truck axles. And I just thought, man, this is a far out world where considering where I'm from. I'd never seen anything like that before. And Martha, she was self-made money. She bought and sold land, terreno. I ended up learning the word. And her whole family worked for her. And so, I mean, you know how the families are over there. So they were around, and me and Martha had a really good time. We began to do a lot of things together. It turns out that she didn't really have to be working per se all the time. Martha was a very warm-hearted person. I saw that as I saw the way that she acted towards the people around her, even the servants. I'm gonna tell you what, you guys, the sex was really good. And that really, I mean, besides the fact that it turned out we started to really like each other, the sex was really good. And she told me about it. She'd tell me, 3 orgasmos, 3 orgasms, stuff like that. She'd tell me, you know, that time or whatever. But what was interesting, we'd be in a mall and we'd be looking at sunglasses or something, and she'd say, is that expensive for you? And I would say, yes. It'd be some Ray-Bans or some shit. And because she was just trying to figure out, you know, because Americans are all rich, that's what they hear. But I certainly wasn't at that time. I didn't have much money. But Martha, we began to do a lot of things. We went to restaurants. We went to visit ruins. We did a lot of things together. And as soon as Martha realized I could drive her vehicle, she had me become her chauffeur. And I drove her everywhere. And so we spent a lot of time just having fun together. And one interesting time is we were at a restaurant, and they closed the restaurant but kept it open just for her. It was her and me. I don't remember if Bernardo was there, but they knew her, and she'd been instrumental in them getting that restaurant open. I began to realize that she was very warm-hearted and I came to really like her. She paid for everything. She had my teeth fixed. I needed a tire for my bike, man. No, battery went out. Yeah. She helped me get a battery. I couldn't get the right one. I had to get one a little smaller and fudge it in there. And a tire. So for the tire, she wanted to go get it in the city of Puebla, which is a big city, and they've got one area that's just full of bars. I remember. And I was like, we can get it here, I think. And no, but she just wanted to go there. And so we took off in her SUV, just me and her. She ended up renting us a room, and we spent some time in the city, and all this stuff happened. And I began to know some of her family. I'm living with wealthy, influential Mexican family, right? I began to hang around with a group of gringos and go to their house on the weekends. There's these old retired people down there. There's a group of them. This one couple, they were obviously very wealthy too. They would put out a spread, and we would all go over there and eat, a bunch of us, and they had a beautiful house on the hill, and they had a car, and they would, after that, they would sit and play Uno, which is a kid's game. So I began to make friends with some of the gringos around there. An interesting thing was, of the old gringos that were there, one of them was Eve, and I don't know what country she was from originally, because English obviously wasn't her first language. But she was in her 80s, and she used to come and hang with them guys. And an interesting thing she told me, she said that down here, old people still have value. She said, and people listen to you, and they want you around, and they look out for you. That was an interesting thing, I thought, that she said. I'm sure she's long dead by now, but I remember her telling me about that. Although Harleys were rare, I did begin to run into some of them. As I ventured out into the city alone a lot of times just to mess around and check out the area, I also began to meet guys. Some of the cops rode them. Some of the guys I met, every time I saw one, I would stop and try to talk to the guy, communicate with him. You know, there was even a few little motorcycle clubs I heard of, though I never saw them, but mostly it was small bikes. So at one point, I told Marta about being behind this pickup truck and having all of these people stop us until he dropped some pesos into the cups and they let us through. And she explained to me what had happened there. She said the Indians who live in the mountains, they weren't all put on reservations and all that. She said on occasion, they come out of the mountains and they converge on the toll booth, and the officials get out, they leave, and the people take it over. One of the things you see about down there is the government doesn't have nearly as much power as they do in the U.S., which is good. When the people really get pissed off, and when they really do, they get places. They're able to make change. Anyways, so all the Indians come out of the mountains, they converge, and the officials get out, and the people just hang around the toll booth, and they hit people for tolls when they come through until they finally get tired of doing all that, and they go into the mountains, and the officials come back. So that was an interesting thing to learn about. That's why if I would have known, I would have stopped and given them a few pesos just so I could take a few pictures. This is where it gets kind of interesting, I thought. One day she tells me, she says, we'd learned to communicate a little bit. And she says, I have to go and survey a piece of land. And her sister, Nancy, and her daughter, Lulu, were going to go. You know, they were all going to be there for that. She told me, she said, Bernardo's out of town. He was in Europe. It's just going to be us 3 girls and a bunch of men. She says, and I have to pay them in booze because that's what they want. She says, would you come to be chaperone? And I said, sure, of course I will. So I drive this SUV, and we drive out of town, and we end up on this kind of desolate piece of land out there. And after a little while, Nancy pulls in her little red car, and she's got Lulu, her teenage daughter, with her. Lulu spoke a little English, and we're hanging around, and after a little while, this little pickup truck pulls in, and it's got a bunch of guys in the back. It's a police truck. It's got a bunch of guys in the back, and they're like in Huarache sandals and all that, and they jump out. And Martha opens up the back of that SUV, and it's just full of booze. And they all start drinking. And they march off down into the land to survey it. They've got I don't know what the hell they're doing. I never know what's going on. There's some other interesting stuff that happened to me too there. But they march off down there, and I don't know what's going on. So I get a little bored. So what I do is I start giving Lulu driving lessons in her mom's car, because her mom's scared to do it, right? So me and Lulu are driving around a little bit, and we get back, and finally these guys finish up what they're doing, and they're getting a pretty good buzz on now, right? And so Martha tells me it's time to go. So I get in the driver's seat of that SUV. She gets in next to me, and all these guys pile in the back seat, and they also pile into Nancy's car. And I look at Martha, and she points ahead. She says, drive. So I drive, and we go to this restaurant. Now, we're out of town. We ain't in the city no more. We go to this little restaurant on the outskirts of town in, well, it ain't even on, it's out in the sticks somewhere. And it's got just like a concrete floor. It ain't the nicest place. And we're all at this table, and the girls are buying all this food and all this booze, and they're all drinking, and they're all laughing, and they're all living it up. And Martha turns to me, and she tells me, she says, we're sitting with the city council. So I look, and these guys are all looking at me, and I'm like, cool. And they, whatever, and they go back to partying, right? And she tells me quietly, she says, somehow she communicated it to me. She says, it is necessary that you party with these guys, and that they believe you are their friend, because if you don't, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Your paperwork will go funny, and it will never go through. I was like, no kidding. So I'm looking at Mexican politics at the time. I don't know what it's like now. At the time, and now I'm entertained. Now I'm really entertained. So so I noticed Nancy, she's over there laughing and drinking and joking, and then she'd look at me, she'd go, and then she'd go back to laughing and drinking and partying on, right? And eventually we all left that place, got back in the SUV, and we drove to what looked like some kind of a city building, but it wasn't in the city, but it was some kind of a government building, right? And the girls think it's over. But one of the guys, he says, come on in, They got their own stash of beer, right? So we go into this county building, and I'm sitting, and now we're sitting in some office, and everybody's drinking. These guys got his feet up on the desk. I'm sitting in a windowsill, right? It had like a concrete thing there. And I'm watching these Mexican politics, and inside I'm laughing. I'm like, this is just funny. This is just funny how it works here. And so the next morning, Martha's all hungover, and I don't drink, right? She didn't drink much either, but she was hungover. and I'm looking at her, and I'm like, yeah, how do you feel? And she's giving me dirty looks. And I'm like, she tells me, she says, listen, I have to move some money today from one place to another, she says, and Bernardo's not here. Will you come? And I said, okay. So we go to the bank, and she gets this little suitcase, and we go into town, and we go to the Cafe Italiano, which was the Mexican version of Starbucks at the time. And they've got a little back room we're in. We're in this room, and Nancy's there, and Martha, and she opens up the suitcase, and it's full of money. And some of it's greenbacks. And she hands me the greenbacks to count, because I'm pretty familiar with that money. And them girls take to counting this money. And I don't remember what happened the rest of that day. But back at the house, it was a day or so later, and both of them girls were there. And I says to them, I says, if you girls partied more often, you'd be rich. And they looked at me, and they go, huh? And I said, well, look, this is what I see, okay? I see you go out, you laugh, you drink, you eat, you have a big old party, and the next day you've got a suitcase full of money. If you partied more often, you'd be rich. They both cracked up laughing, right? Also, Martha and Bernardo had a business investment they were really excited about, and they were going to build these bungalows on the outside of town and rent them to the Gringos. That's where the money was, right? And they were excited, and they were hiring a guy to find water. And I told him, I said, I can find water with a couple of coat hangers. Anybody who knows how to do that, most people can. I've practiced with it before. I can find water with a couple of bent coat hangers. So I told him. So I said, all right. So we drove out of town, and this place was quite a ways out of town. And we got to this piece of land where they were going to build this, and I went and found their water for them. But I told them, I said, ain't no Gringo's going to rent here. And they laughed at me, and they were like, because they don't understand our culture. We don't understand theirs. They just know that there's Gringos here that spend money, and it's a good business opportunity, right? So I said, no. And they realized I was serious. And they were like, how come? I says, because the people who come here who are tourists are going to stay closer in town. They don't have a car. They want to see the sights down in the town. They're not going to come stay way out here. And the people who have a car already live here. And eventually I took Martha down to the park down in the city. And there's an area and, restaurants and stuff. And we walked around together, and I started talking to the Gringos. Sometimes I would wonder if I could even talk anymore down there, because it was so much Spanish around me. But I started asking them, would you rent out there? And they all said no. They said, it's a renter's market here. There's a lot of places to stay right here in town. And I told them. And so they changed what they were going to use that land for. They decided to build it and rent it to Mexicans, what they were going to build. So that was one thing I did for them. But eventually the time came to go. And I started getting my bike ready. And doing oil changes and fixing little stuff on it. And nobody seemed to notice that I was getting ready to go. And I just kept my mouth shut because Martha wanted me to stay. And but back then, I was really on the road. I mean, I just couldn't stay anywhere that long. I had to see the world. I'd had girlfriends on and off all my life, and that wasn't as important to me as being out on the road and seeing the world and doing all these things. And I was just going to go. It was time to go. And so when the time came to leave, she asked if she could ride to the border with me. And I said, okay. And so I packed my bike for two, and we took off and headed for the border. On the way there, she rented us like a nice hotel. Another time we camped. We came into a place to camp that I found along the side of the road. And this road went back in, and there was like a parking area or an area in there. I think it was dirt or in all these trees or some shit. And there was a couple there. And I was like, oh, how you guys doing? And I was like, yeah, we're going to camp here, blah, blah, blah. And then that couple looked at us as a young couple, and they turned around, and they got in their car, and they left. And Martha laughed at me afterwards. She said, they came here for sex, Scotty. That's what they were doing here. We showed up and ruined it for them. So we rode all the way up to the border. And from the border, I think she took a bus home. It was interesting. For as wealthy as she was, she could ride on a bus for 6 hours without any problem. She could eat in a restaurant that had a dirt floor. Those things didn't affect her at all. But she certainly acted like a rich person. Now, I came back again and stayed with her for a couple months on another time. And that's a whole nother adventure, because we spent some time in Acapulco, or near Acapulco. And we had all these things happen. But that year, a lot of things happened for me. But eventually, we kind of began to lose track of each other. She'd call me up missing me, want me to come back, but it's a long ride, man. And she tried to get the paperwork so that she could come to the U.S., but she couldn't get it done, even with a lawyer, man. Even though she owned property and everything down there, she couldn't get it done. And so eventually, she ended up getting a German boyfriend. She didn't like Mexican guys. She ended up getting a German guy who spoke Spanish. And when I talked to her, she was like, yes, come visit, but we're going to have to be friends. I got this guy now. And I was like, oh, ain't that something? Later on, they had some problem, because she talked to me about it. with a teacher strike in Oaxaca. I don't understand the whole thing, but it changed the dynamics of the place. The military was in there. There was a big problem there. There's all other stuff that happened to you. And I think her business went under, the land business. I don't know. But I came back years later because I lost how to get a hold of her. And I came back years later and I went to the house that she lived in. She had had that house built there specifically for the view. And the people who lived there then had never heard of her. And so I've never talked to her again. I certainly wish I could. She was 50 years old at the time. I was maybe 37, something like that. So she has to be old by now. So I've never heard from her again. And that's the story. And with that, you guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Y'all can let me know in the comment section if this kind of thing worked for you. And I'll see y'all on the next video.